everybody. We will start the last roundtable of this day on international organization of value chains. So thank you very much for staying for the last roundtable. Let me just briefly introduce the discussion, and then I will present the four panelists. Two of them are with us today, and two of them are joining online. So we all know that global value chains have faced unprecedented shocks over the past decade. It has been said today, and it seems that those shocks are happening more and more frequently. Just to name a few, but there will be no surprise: Brexit, COVID-19, disruption in the Red Sea, and growing trade tensions. These obviously challenges have had a clear impact on how global value chains are structured, that is to say, where companies choose to produce and how they organize their supply networks. You all have in mind some buzzwords that have been a lot mentioned recently to describe how things have evolved, namely reshoring, nearshoring, friendshoring, China plus one, and we will be discussing all that today. To make things a little bit more concrete, let me just give you an example from the container shipping industry and what we have observed lately. Against a backdrop of rising trade tension, between January and May, global container shipping volumes grew by 4% compared to last year. And when we look closer, we see big shifts in trade routes. Namely, when we look at China's overall export, it grew by 8% over the period I mentioned, but it dropped by 8% for the direct exports from China to the US. And at the same time, exports to other trade partners surged. And just to list a few of them, exports from the US to Southeast Asia increased by 18%. Export from China to Middle East increased by 25%, and export from China to EU 27 and Latin America grew by 11% over the first 5 months of the year. On the import side, total imports from China fell by 7%, and direct import in China from the US dropped dramatically by 40%. These shifts do suggest that some long-term trend, like the growing role of Southeast Asia in global trade, are speeding up against a backdrop of decoupling between China and the US. And the current situation is obviously full of uncertainty and open questions. One major challenge is how these new manufacturing hubs, notably in the Southeast Asia, will manage to deal with the combined pressure from both the US and China, and it has been mentioned this morning during the presentation by Kevin. And the recent trade deal reached between the US and Vietnam, which focuses on transshipment, somehow exemplify this very issue. And in this context, and to help us to understand some of these challenges better, I'm very pleased to welcome a panel of very recognized experts. We have Daria Taglioni, a research manager for trade and international integration at World Bank. We have Arthur Barillas de T, co-founder and president of OVRSEA, a digital freight forwarder. And joining online, we have Agatha Kratz, a partner at Rhodium Group, leading their corporate advisory work. And Julian Hinz, professor of international economics at Bielefeld University and head of the Research Center Trade Policy at the Kiel Institute for the World Economy. So maybe let's start with Agatha. Agatha, since 2017, protectionist trade policies and rising trade tension have been reshaping value chain and global trade. And it was even before the second Trump administration. At Rhodium, you have been studying this trend very closely. Could you explain how the first trade war impacted global value chain and international trade, and highlight which sector were most affected?
Yeah. Thank you, Simon. I hope everyone is able to hear me in the room. I'm sorry for not being here, just family and childcare reason. I'm sure a lot of you know about this, but I'm delighted to be on this panel. I'm also humbled to be with Daria and Julian and real economists and modelers in the room, because what we do at Rhodium is mostly to look at data and to then observe trends. And so I wanna put that in perspective with what Julian and then Daria will be coming into to add on to what we've been saying. But over the past few years of intense debate, we focus on China, but intense debate on China-US decoupling, China-US de-risking, EU-China de-risking, we've been saying, okay, let's go look at the numbers to see what is actually happening in supply chains, right? And let's look at very simple numbers to do with trade and investment flows and value add and trade in certain inputs and trade in finished goods and how that compares, etc., to try and see what's happening globally when we're speaking about supply chains. And so there's just a couple of trends that I wanted to highlight here as an introduction. Those trends can seem contradictory, but they're happening at the same time, which is leading to a lot of the confusion in the debate today about whether or not the US and China are decoupling, whether or not we're seeing a fragmentation of global trade, deglobalization. The first trend that we're seeing is that there's very, very clearly happening at the moment a diversification of supply chains, right? Whether you look at it from the FDI lens, you see companies that invest less in China, invest more in alt-China hubs, whatever you want to call those. You see more investment pouring into ASEAN, in particular Mexico, some of the MENA region, etc. You also see, and this is, to everyone's knowledge, China's share of especially US imports dropping over time, plummeted by as much as 9 percentage points. I mean, this is a huge, huge, huge change in just over a few years. This is also happening, I should add, not just with the US, but with Japan as well, where China's share of Japan imports has been decreasing over time. And so you've had a real reconfiguration of at least the input kind of sourcing side of the economy. And so in that landscape, you've seen the emergence of what we would call linkages countries, right? And so you've had the emergence of Vietnam and Mexico and most of ASEAN really retaking and recapturing market shares, import market shares, especially with the US. And of course, a lot of this has been shallow, a lot of this has been final processing, but I should add that over the last few years, we've been looking at FDI trends in these countries. There's been a solidification as well of those supply chains, right? So it used to be final assembly moved from China, usually a Chinese company, onshore to an ASEAN country, usually Vietnam. But now we're seeing tier 1, tier 2 suppliers also moving onshore. You've got a little bit of a critical mass that's built up so much so that you now have ecosystems, full ecosystem recreating in some of those countries, right? So you've got a solidification of this diversification. And so you have what you could say is a partial re-globalization, right? Like it used to be that China sucked up enormous amounts of supply chains, and that was the main trend for the past 20 years, but you've had a little bit of re-globalization with longer trade flows, longer supply chains, with now an additional stop in the middle, and you've had countries that have been able to recapture some market share. Now, all of this, and this is where it gets a little bit contradictory, all of this is happening all while China is continuing to dominate, if not dominating even more certain other supply chains, right? So if you look at China's share of global manufacturing value add, if you look at China's share of global exports, that is still rising today, right? And so both of those things are true. China is still capturing, absorbing supply chains in a number of sectors. Of course, everyone thinks about green tech, but even upstream, when you look at electronics, China is capturing more and more of this. China is capturing more of textile and fabric manufacturing, right? So even in sectors that are typically kind of low value add, or that you would think about as low value add, China is still managing to capture manufacturing capacity and market shares. And so this is the contradiction we have to live with today, that you have incredibly efficient manufacturing in China, by the way, less and less focused or less and less driven by pure labor cost consideration or even production cost consideration, but also to do, and mainly to do now, with economies of scale, economies of scope, network economies, very, very efficient logistical networks in China that just make it so easy to produce on the ground. Of course, automation gaining ground in China, and the quality and quantity of labor on the ground, right? And so all of those factors, despite growing labor costs in China, are what they are concentrating and attracting so much manufacturing. And so that is still going on. And then the only kind of diversion of difference from this is the policy shock that the US imposed on the world and global supply chains in 2017 and now again today. And so the only thing that seems to be moving the needle these days is therefore very, very strong, very potent policy shocks, such as the ones that happened with the first 301 tariffs on certain Chinese sectors, continuing on to today. Some of this is also tech and trade control, full import bans on certain Chinese technology, etc. Very different picture, I should add, and maybe a few last words. When we look at the EU or South Korea, for example, the EU and South Korea have both increased their dependency on Chinese imports, input, value add, all of it, and even doubled down on investment in China. So it's a very different picture depending on which country you're looking at and which trade partner you're looking at. And then, a few more observation. I mean, is this all durable? We're in an area and in a moment of extreme uncertainty. Do we think this continues, or do we think that this was a parenthesis in a way in the last few years? There's a lot of potential and more potential in ASEAN and for ASEAN to capture more supply chain, right? I mean, Vietnam has been the target of a lot of diversification, but Thailand and Malaysia and Cambodia offer a lot of opportunities in terms of skills and in terms of just general ability to gather manufacturing strengths. But there is a real ceiling in Vietnam, and Vietnam might be one of the issues going forward, right? Vietnam has had so much success that it might actually be a liability going forward. It's very likely that labor costs are going to rise very quickly. It's very likely that the infrastructure that exists in Vietnam will not be enough to manage its success and the success it's had in capturing diversified supply chain. So that is one to look at very closely. And then the second thing that will be a big question mark on diversification going forward is just China and China's willingness to let it happen. Because, as I said, a lot of diversification into ASEAN was linked to Chinese companies moving to Vietnam and Thailand and Malaysia. It was Chinese citizens, Chinese engineers, Chinese know-how, and that can be restricted. And as a matter of fact, we've seen China put in place a system of export controls and a system of restrictions on outbound people flow that could come as a restriction and even a complete barrier to diversification. Chinese inputs are so critical in feeding those diversified supply chain, and so export control can also be applied to just inputs used in Vietnam and Malaysia to make products for the US. And then China, and we've seen that already happen in the past kind of 6, 7, 8 years. When prices change in China, because China is such a big producer of certain goods, especially in electronics, and a global price maker, then when prices fall in China, then certain diversification advances in countries like Cambodia and Bangladesh can actually be undone just because Chinese goods really become overly competitive, right? And so it's also a very fragile diversification so far of those supply chain that we were looking at. And then, of course, we'll have to see what US policy looks like. We've seen, and that will be part of the Q&A, we've seen the first US deal with an ASEAN nation with Vietnam last week. There's very little detail about what exactly is in the deal, but there's already signs that the US is pushing for Vietnam to try and decrease dependencies on Vietnamese on Chinese inputs and Chinese value add. And so that, of course, will play as another constraint, another break on the movement we've seen over the past few years. So let me stop here. But once again, delighted to be with all of you.
Thank you very much, Agatha. It was extremely complete, and it offers a great introduction to the subject. You mentioned the recent announcement from the US on trade policy. And obviously that brought a lot of uncertainty, and front-loading can make short-term impact that we have recently observed harder to interpret what will be the longer-term effect. And in this respect, macro trade models help to clarify more structural changes that we may expect from that. With the Kiel Institute model expertise, Julian, could you explain the main macroeconomic forces behind a shift in value chain and trade flows as a response to this trade policy announcement? and what can we expect in terms of trade diversion? Notably, I know that you have been working a lot on those aspects recently.
Thanks a lot, first of all, for having me. I'm sorry I couldn't make it to Marseille in person this year, so looking forward to next year's edition. Yeah, so I think in many ways I fully agree with Agatha what her interpretation is, looking at what's going on in response to these very recent shocks. But I think sometimes it makes sense to take a bit of a step back, because right now we're obviously facing lots of uncertainty in terms of actual trade policy. I mean, right now so my phone is here to the right in front of me, because any minute now, I think we can expect the letter from Donald Trump with some number that they will impose on their imports from the EU. So there's enormous uncertainty when it comes to US trade policy right now. There's also some uncertainty, I would say, when it comes to responses to US trade policy. But there are also other sources of uncertainty. Just in the past week, I think both bulk carriers were sunk by the Houthis in the Red Sea. This is something that, maybe right now, I guess to this audience, I don't really need to talk much about this, but lots of ships are avoiding that part. That came as a shock in November 2023, December 2023. That created uncertainty about, okay, how is this going to affect economies that are directly connected to this route? And so it seems like there's been a lot more of this, let's call it bilateral uncertainty, right? So we're adding uncertainty to what's happening within countries, and now we're adding uncertainty to what's happening between countries. And I think to come back to how I started this, I think we should sometimes take a step back and look at how big those effects can be. I mean, just looking at the data, I think often people, if you were to ask someone on the street, they would be surprised to learn that for the EU, China is a little less than 10% of its exports and imports. Same for the US, right? It's sometimes, if you're following the news, it seems like that's, something happens in the US, and at least in Germany where I'm sitting, but my guess is in France it's not that different. Something happens in the US, and this is big news, and this is all going to affect us very severely in one way or another. But 10% of our exports go there, 10% of our imports, a little less from the US, a bit more from China coming from there. Goods exports and imports, or let's talk about exports, are roughly a third of what Germany is producing. And so it's 10% of that third that Germany is producing. So we're talking about 3.5%, if you want to round it up, that are affected. And then we're not talking about a complete cessation of trade or a ban or something. It's an increase in costs. And so obviously this may be quite different when you look at certain sectors, certain firms. They may be much more affected than the average economy. But I think there's often a fear that something happening in the US or China translates into dramatic changes and impacts on this side of the Atlantic. And I think that's it's always important to make to bring that message across, that what really matters for Europe is what's happening in Europe. So 2/3 of Germany's exports, and I think that number is roughly similar for France, 2/3 of what we produce and export stay in the EU. So what really matters as a first order effect is what happens in the EU. And that also conversely means that, if we want to, irrespective of what happens now in the next couple of days, if we want to try to cushion any blow from this, there are some quite low-hanging fruit to counter those negative effects. Let's deepen EU integration just a tiny bit more, and I think in terms of welfare, we're already offsetting what's happening there. Now, you asked about those main mechanisms. Still, I mean, right now with this Kiel trade model, we're projecting that those Liberation Day tariffs, as they're called, or I like to put them in air quotes, the reciprocal tariffs. There's nothing reciprocal about them, but they call them reciprocal tariffs. What would they entail in terms of economic costs on EU countries, so globally economies. Those tariffs that are announced in the past couple of days almost exactly mirror those April 2nd tariffs. So I think those simulations are still quite valid. And what you see is that, yes, for Germany, I think it's minus 1.5 percentage points in real GDP. For France, it's slightly lower than that. EU average is, I think, minus 0.12. That's not nothing, but it certainly doesn't help in a situation where growth is lackluster. But it's really not a big blow, right? That's a bit different when you look at more exposed economies, Canada, Mexico. Even though their tariffs have been, there's not been much talk about tariffs there since that last deal that exempts lots of these tariffs from when they're USMCA compliant. But I think the one big loser from all of this is the US itself, because in a way they're fighting, they're starting a fight with everyone in the bar, but for everyone else in that bar, it's just that one crazy guy who's picking a fight with everyone at the same time. And so I think, in that sense, it's important to keep in mind that the overall size of the shock is likely to be very manageable for many countries. But I think there's a more structural and policy-driven response that could make this much more dangerous, and that's how countries respond to this. And if there's any sort of domino effect of, the US is now imposing big tariffs, now we need to make sure that we protect our industries now. So I think there is some risk that's likely bigger. The risk of that is likely bigger than the direct impact that will be maybe coming from those US tariffs. We're going to talk about trade diversion, I think, in a minute. So I keep it at this for now.
Thank you very much, Julian. Yes, indeed, we will talk about trade diversion in the second round. Daria, the world is facing more frequent shocks, reshaping the advantage of globally dispersed and complex value chains. I know that you have been working recently on this question. How can businesses and policymakers navigate this uncertainty, especially in highly interconnected and complex industries?
Thank you. So, yes, the reflection was about some of the measures that have been implemented. We talked about tariffs, but of course, export controls are also one of the measures that the US has implemented, scaled up, and China as well. And those type of measures, in a way, are more, especially export controls, are more designed for let's say, conventional industries where there is an obvious choke point, and that's the idea. I block, for instance, the export of the key technology, and that will actually give me leverage. But a lot of the sectors that are intensive in innovation, like the digital sectors, they are not linear anymore. They are not vertically integrated anymore, but they are increasingly done in a network way, where there are a range of subsystems that are loosely coordinated with one another. In each subsystem, as Thierry was showing this morning, there has been an incredible increase in concentration. So where 10 years ago we would see several companies playing one function, now it's 1, 2, or 3, which has made the, sometimes I call it a concentration of supply and a diversification of demand. Why? Because then there has been an incredible effort in connecting these subsystems with many more industries. And that's really, I think, one big shift that we are seeing, this concentration of supply and diversification of demand. That per se creates fragility, because basically the subsystem is controlled by one firm, and then by extension the country that has the regulatory power of that over that firm, and it plugs in a unique way which is not easy to reproduce to many other industries. So those are basically complex industries. What that makes is a couple of important differences. First of all, interconnect standards become really important. And in what I will say that being active, be it a firm or a government, in those interconnect standards become increasingly important. And platforms are an important new actor, which traditionally, as in industrial organization or trade, we do not really think about too much. And so those are the two areas where we need to think more. So this complexity, I think that to a large extent is inevitable, because it brings unprecedented innovation and scale. So if companies will want to keep having this scale and this innovation, I don't think we will scale back substantially from this way of doing things. And by the way, I studied it in the digital industries, but my understanding of other industries, such as the vaccine production, is that it is also, some of this logic is there. So the COVID vaccines probably were not possible to be found and put to production so quickly if there wasn't some of this diffused innovation system. So this complexity is there to stay, the fragility not. And I think that the companies are already trying to address this fragility. What I think they should be doing is what actually I'm observing them already starting to do is, so there was a first phase where they were indeed diversifying and building redundancies, but I think that was a short-term reaction. What increasingly seems they are being doing is some kind of strategic filtering. They ask which interdependencies are worth preserving, which productions need to be rerouted, or which relationship they need to be kept, but perhaps the terms changed. And I think that when they are responding to uncertainty, in my opinion, there are three sources of uncertainty now. We've been talking a lot in this conference about policy volatility, policy uncertainty, which is abrupt shifts in tariffs, in subsidies, in sanctions. But there are at least another two dimensions of uncertainty that, again, as economists, I mean, this is really like a menu of things that we will have to do as economists, is uncertainty in standards. So that comes from many sources, the proliferation of NTMs, or even private standards, ESG standards from companies, and then all the divergent regulations in digital trade or data regulations. But so we see this proliferation of standards, both generated by the private and the public sector, which are leading to regulatory sorting and fragmentation. So basically, companies and countries that do not have strong institutions, they opt out of certain relationships. And then because of policy uncertainty and because standards uncertainty, you end up with relational fragility. So basically, there is an erosion of trust, and the long-distance relationships, or the ones with politically exposed contractual partners, become the more risky. And some work, again, we are doing with Thierry and other co-authors tries to ask that question. So what do firms need to do there? They need to manage the configuration of their supply chain, thinking really of this multi-level, geopolitical, environmental, regulatory, and technological. They all these levels interact with one another. They are not necessarily overlapping, and so they really need to think them through. Rather than thinking of the China plus one or shifting to Vietnam, I think there is, again, a more complex decision tree that starts with mapping risks and exposure, and then clustering critical components in certain countries with strong regulatory frameworks. So I don't know if I don't want to make names of countries, but obviously, there are countries that in different industries have different risk level, and then of course create fallback risk strategies, and that's where logistics comes into play. And so really thinking about the governance and build increasingly flexible and modular contracts, so that they can be rewired, and finally really invest in this participating to the definition of the standards. But that cannot be done by the firms alone. It's a shared responsibility between the firms and the governments in making it work. So this new rules of the game is around standards. I think now, as much as more than previously, and it needs collaboration between firms and then between firms and governments. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Daria. Very interesting insights, and we will come back to some of the implication on trade and logistics maybe a little bit later. Arthur, as a leading freight forwarder, you have a unique view on what is happening on the ground. I think that it can be great if you can tell us how all what we have been discussing rather theoretically so far echoes what you see on the ground, and how your clients adapt to this evolution in supply chains.
Yes, I will try to. So I took notes of the very interesting interventions from the panelists. So I'd be glad to maybe give a bit of a on-the-ground perspective, just to give a few words about what we do. We are somewhat of a travel agency for goods. So basically we have container moved around on CMA CGM's vessels or MSC vessels or on planes, etc. around the world, and we do that for companies. So we have very much a control tower view on the, I would say, everything that's related to trade. Also, we have a very big customs activity. So I would say very operational on the topics that we discussed today. And I'd be glad to come back on some of the trends and topics that were touched by the different panelists. The first one for me is the first one brought up by Agatha, which was diversification on supply lanes. So this is something that we do see on a day-to-day basis. Obviously, it was not created by the second wave of tariffs from Trump. It's something that's a bit more long-standing, but we do see a very strong emergence from Vietnam, obviously, among these countries. We do see a very strong growth from India as well on some industries. We do see Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, Myanmar to some extent also being very, very dynamic and very attractive from the garment or fashion industry, for instance. So I absolutely second that. What I found very interesting about Agatha's presentation as well was to say that obviously we have supply diversification, but there is still a very strong dominance of China. And what I think I should share with you is the, I would say, rigidities for customers to switch some of the business and the suppliers that they work with in China to substitute them with other suppliers or countries. I will give two industries for which I believe this is particularly interesting. So healthcare or luxury customers have very rigid supply chains in the sense that they have very rigid norms, be it in terms of quality, health, compliance, etc. So once they've gone through the process of auditing, putting the supplier at the level of quality that they require, switching that is very hard. In the fashion industry, it can be easier because know-hows can be exported more or less easily. But for some industries, it's actually very rigid. And I wholeheartedly believe what was told, which is China is has built such crazy scale effects and ecosystem effects that for some customers, switching out of China is just not possible, or at least not on the short term. Policy shocks have been obviously extremely strong. I think the chairman of CMA CGM said it best a few weeks ago. The ships to the US were 50% empty just a few days or weeks after the announcement of the new tariffs. So obviously, these shocks are extremely strong on the short term. What we do see, however, which I find to be somewhat puzzling, which is, first of all, the effect of front-loading was, so basically shipping before the tariff wave was very strong. And if you look at the numbers at the half year, we are actually net positive, even due to, I would say, to the front-loading, which is somewhat puzzling. So we still trade more given the constraints that we have. Obviously, this is something that would need to be further assessed, in the long run. And also, if you read the news, you to the Agatha's point regarding the transfer of know-how from China to the other countries, maybe you've seen that Foxconn had to relocate some of their engineers from India to China, and there's obviously, I think, an increasing pressure from China to make sure that some of the know-hows don't export to competitive countries, as easily. To some of Julian's point, I will say that there is no slowdown on the Red Sea, as we've discussed, and this is still a major disruption, which allows for a bit of the overcapacity that we know on the ocean shipping to be absorbed. As you may know, there's more ships than demand currently in the market, and there's quite a large spread, maybe 6-7% in overcapacity that is being vastly drawn out by longer transit times, due to the Cape of Good Hope, route. What I will share as well is also, so Julian spoke to the actually low exposition of EU customers to some of these, tariffs, if you look at the numbers. So this is absolutely true from a direct perspective. I will share one story that I find compelling, which are the indirect aspects that some customers may face. We have a collagen customer, so basically, selling collagen to chemical players. Their business comes from fish skin, so they actually import fish skin from South Asian countries, and these fish skin are actually a byproduct of fish fillets that are built for the American market. And with the new tariffs, the fish fillet market in the US could be tanking. So it poses some, I would say, byproduct danger for some of our own industries, where if tomorrow this market close, they will not be able to build their supplies the same way, etc. So I find that it's interesting to look also at the, I would say, indirect impact. And when it comes to Daria's point regarding the complexity, increasing complexity and the diversification of demand, we do see that on a very day-to-day basis. If you look at the ocean carrier concentration, there's less and less players than 10 or 20 years ago. And we do find that the demand is more versatile, more spread out. So absolutely second that as well.
Thank you very much for these insights from the ground. We will start a second round of intervention, maybe looking a little bit more in future, even if all that is very uncertain, as you all said during your first intervention. But companies have to make decisions in this uncertain environment. And maybe we can start with you, Daria. All what you described regarding the implication of this increase of taking into account complexity to assess the optimal way to structure supply chain. What are the forcing impact on trade and logistics going forward? And do you see obvious implication of what we have been describing?
Yes, but first let me answer to a point. So you were saying that you find still high orders in the first half of the year. Actually, we looked at that and we see that a lot is anticipation effects of the tariffs. So I don't know whether there will be a rebound given this TACO strategy, but that's what we were, that basically companies are filling in inventories. On the corporate strategies, so assuming that this world I was describing before, it's going to dominate at least some important sectors. So what corporate strategies would do, I guess, would adjust to this world. And so from vertical control, as I said, I think they're putting more emphasis on orchestrating this complex system of systems. And cost optimization is still important, but then really the governance of the dependent. So the idea is dependencies are there to stay. How do I govern them better? And I think that decoupling is one strategy, but not the only one. When it comes to logistics and inventory, so a lot of emphasis has been on inventory and logistics, but I think that increasingly there is a space for logistic companies to provide contingency planning by analyzing, processing with the help of researchers the data, right? And I think this partnership, it's an expression of a company that is seeing that demand. And then, as I said, really, I think worrying about this platform-based architectures, both as researchers and as companies, it's important. So the logistic companies in this world that is coming, probably there will be at least some of them the possibility to be not anymore movers, but really these providers of upstream scenario planners, but also enablers of compliance. As I said, the NTMs, the rules of origin, the private standards, CO2 need to prove CO2 emissions, dual-use trade. This will all require compliance, have huge compliance requirements that a lot of companies are not simply staffed to do. And I think that's an area where logistics companies could find a space. And so, and I would like to conclude with one point. Basically, what do logistics companies? They can help the visibility, increase the visibility on the risks, right? Through all this, through processing more data. But then if they stop there, they will have contributed to increase exposure. So what we need is that they engage in improving the visibility, but also in producing a strategy to address this fragilities that will be more easily visible, no? And that, of course, means rethinking connectivity, which needs to be done by logistics company, but as I said before, not alone. So what the logistics companies can do is to produce services that address those requests. But then what you need is that policy-making world needs to really invest in generating more trust, especially in the digital space, in a diplomacy of standards, and into ensuring interoperability. And I think this is the challenge, and that's why this point of cooperation is really important. I think we need the cooperation between the public and the private sector and researchers and operational companies more than ever. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Daria. Julian, you said earlier that you were about to talk about trade diversion, and I notably know that you've been writing a report regarding what would be the adequate response from the EU authorities to the threat by the US administration. Can you elaborate a little bit more on both subjects, be it trade diversion and how we can protect from that, and how we should respond to a US threat?
Yeah, great question. And I think I want to start with getting back to this point about some byproducts that suddenly may not exist on from the suppliers that were there before. Because I think that's a very interesting point. And so that's one of the general equilibrium effects that I think are really not trivial, but often can really drive outcomes. And there's this nice, so that's an example I didn't know yet about, which was I thought very interesting. There's this episode in Germany or in Europe, but it was particularly debated in Germany in 2022 when there was this discussion about embargoing and cutting ourselves off from Russian gas. And so there was this one CEO of BASF, this big chemicals company, And he said that if Germany were to do that, then lights would be switched off across Germany, and especially in his part of, or in one of his production plants in Ludwigshafen, one of the biggest chemical production plants in all of Europe. And they have they had the gas consumption equivalent to that of Switzerland. Okay, so this one production plant. And so he made a point, like, look, this is how much gas we're importing. Almost everything is coming from Russia. And, if we don't get that gas anymore, it's over. And, that means that, essentially everything is over in Germany. Now, fast forward 3 years, there was effectively a decoupling from gas. BASF is making profits, and record profits actually in the past 2 years. How is that? How can that be, right? When he was talking about the plant shutting down, well, they produced a lot of ammonium using natural gas from Russia. Suddenly they couldn't do it anymore. They were scrambling. Okay, how do we get ammonium? We just buy it from somewhere else. Okay, and so that was the solution. So essentially it was, they shifted production stages and just don't produce it anymore themselves. Their gas consumption is down by, I think, 90% in that one plant. So not anymore the equivalent of Switzerland. Lots of empty pipelines going there now. But the main point is that, I think I would be, those general equilibrium effects here, they can also really help offset outcomes. And I think sometimes it's very difficult from the outside to see how markets can shape those outcomes. But in general, I would be optimistic that there are alternatives, that there are different ways of making things work. And I think this is a great example that speaks to this. The other thing that obviously is going to be driving effects is not those, you could call them the direct effects, the partial equilibrium effects, right? So there's an increase in trade barriers between the US and let's say Europe. And we saw that, due to front loading but a drop in the past couple of weeks and months, overall, it's still even net positive. But let's say that this persists over a couple of years. I'm sure that trade is going to go down a bit. But as companies will try to find new suppliers, companies will try to find new markets, there's going to be shifts to those flows that would have gone to the US had there not been these new frictions. And I think that's something that's, again, not trivial, that there are going to be these shifts in where you supply, where you get your supplies from, your intermediate inputs, and where your markets are going to be. But I think this is, and you can compute this using our models under those assumptions that this is going to be the partial equilibrium effect. That's sort of the direct effect, and then you have lots of rerouting and then reconfigurations of value chains that counterbalance often to a large degree these impacts. And so again, I really wouldn't underestimate those. Now, coming to the point of one of those trade diversion forces that is often discussed now is China. Assume China effectively stops exporting stuff produced in China to the US. Now, all of this is going to flood the European market. Or, I talked with a colleague a couple of weeks ago. They have the exact same discussion in South Africa for some reason, and so they're fearing that all of this stuff is now coming to South Africa. Why would it, right? So, question is, I think what you should look at is, okay, assume that there is, there would obviously be some rerouting. But the why should it all, and how big should we expect that flood of goods to be? Now, I think taking a step back, you should think about, okay, of the stuff that's being produced in China, where is that stuff sold? And 80% of the stuff that's being produced in China is sold in China. And then again, you have 20% of those things that are produced in China. Those we call exports. They cross the border and they are coming to other countries. And so roughly 15% of Chinese exports go to Europe or to the EU, and roughly 15% of Chinese exports went to the US until a couple of months ago, right? So think about, those 20% of stuff that previously went to the US would now be rerouted to other countries. And of those 20%, it's roughly 15% that, all else being equal, should be should now end up in as extra trade flows from China to the EU. And that's not much. I mean, in absolute numbers, that is not much. Now, is that really going to be the case? We will see. But I mean, if I think it's the fear of having a huge wave of imports coming from China to the EU or to South Africa or to any other country, I think is really overblown. And I think the biggest fear that I have is that countries preemptively try to counterbalance that by themselves raising tariffs on imports from China out of fear that there is now this big wave of stuff coming. I think that would be dangerous. Now, should there be a dramatic increase in flows, then we should ask, okay, how can that be possible? Usually, under usual circumstances, stuff produced in China, 80% of that stays in China. Okay, so if there's a lot more coming, then there will be grounds for thinking about alternative mechanisms to try to counter those flows, and not safeguards, which would be usually the sort of the preemptive case for trying to counter such flows for. Such a dramatic increase in imports. But if China is for some reason somehow pushing all this stuff to Europe, then there are other mechanisms that are under WTO rules, the proper tools to address those. I think so. I wouldn't be concerned that there is a big flood, and in case there is quite a bit of excess imports from China, then one should look at the tools at disposal, which does not mean that we should preemptively, or for sure should not mean that we preemptively raise import barriers to imports from China or anywhere else in the world just out of fear that now lots of stuff is coming. So this is it from my side, but I think so. I'm adding that this nice example of the fish skin to my repertoire of general equilibrium effects that we should take more seriously when we think about the effects. But it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. So I'd be interested to hear in 3 months, 6 months, 12 months time to see what those did, and I'm pretty sure that the market had some response to that.
Thank you very much, Julian. I think that what you said just highlight the uncertainty regarding trade policy, be it the retaliation that we can expect from US trade partners, but also from these US trade partners toward all the trade partners and so on and so forth. So you have a lot of scenarios you can draw out of that. Agatha, you have been working on different scenarios, and this exercise of scenario planning is probably very relevant in the current juncture. Can you tell us a little bit more about these scenarios and how it can help corporates to make informed decision?
Yeah, absolutely, Simon. So the first thing I wanted to react to Julian's point on flows kind of naturally redirecting, because I wonder how your model and your work takes into account cases like critical raw materials, where China is pretty much the only source, and so if there's no source, there's no source. And I would love to discuss that in the Q&A if anyone picks it up. But I think it's one of the counterexamples that we're facing very, very directly at the moment. So that's the first thing. The second thing on scenario, this has been very interesting for us, right? Because we're a research company first and foremost. We're not a geopolitical shop. We're an economics first shop to start with, and despite that, over the past 12 months, we've had companies after companies come to us and say, can you work with us on scenario planning, right? And as researchers, I mean, many of you in the room will know, and on the panel, we mostly look forward. It's not a built-in capacity to look. We mostly look backward, right? Like what happened the last 5 years, 10 years, 30 years, and how do I explain this, rather than looking forward. So it's been a little bit of a cultural, if not philosophical, change on the team to try and look forward all of a sudden and try and make scenarios for the future. The other thing that we've learned in the process is that scenario planning is actually very complicated and very hard, and it relies on a very rigorous baseline, right? And so you need to do it right, and to do it right, you need to follow certain methodologies that are trial and tested. And so just a few lessons learned for everyone here. The first thing is you've got to start with the question that your client or that your contact, that you as a company are asking yourself, right? And so it's going to be a very, very different question if you're working with CMA, just to take one of the companies in the world here, thinking about supply chain, thinking about trade redirection, or if you're working with a company, and I would cite ASML here just because they're the most well-known company in Europe by now, and very, very focused on trade, on tech controls, right? And therefore a very different question to answer in your scenario. So you need to start with the right question that is fit for the right audience and for the right company. But for all of them, it's very helpful to try and see the word in alternative futures, right? Because things are moving so fast, and there are a range of possibilities and probabilities ahead of us. And even when you draw and when you work on very, very distinct scenarios, and as a matter of fact, Julian and I are working on a couple at the moment, they're very extreme. They're what we call bookend scenarios, right? Of trade fragmentation versus trade alignment and trade blocks. But both of them look somewhat credible at the moment, right? So the world where we are now at this junction, with policy choices shifting so fast, and with policymakers being willing to just break things very, very deeply, means that the futures we're looking at, even if they're very different, are actually quite critical. So that is something that puzzles me once again, that those two bookend scenarios are, in a way, both of them equally credible to me at this stage, one of complete fragmentation and one of kind of block building around the US and around China. And then you have to ask yourself, what is really driving my scenario, right? So here we're speaking about supply chain, we're speaking about trade. And so once again, taking maybe CMA as an example, thinking about the future of supply chain relocation, you have to think about what is driving this, right? And from our work to date, we really see, and we really kind of believe at this stage that two things drive supply chain relocation. One is the economics and the economics condition, especially in China versus the rest of the world, right? And so you have to think about futures where China is deeply, absolutely, and even more so than today, attractive for manufacturing, right? And it could be because the renminbi depreciate, could be because automation just explodes, and an AI-powered automation of manufacturing means that producing in China is even easier than it was in the past. Or you could have a future where China starts to think about rebalancing the economy, spending more on consumption, and hence letting go maybe of some industries, some of the lower margin industries, and just allowing some of, from an economic standpoint, allowing some of that to relocate, right? So very different potential futures, both of them slightly credible, right? And then the second big factor is, of course, the policy impulse, what the US does, what the EU does, what China does itself as well, what host countries in Vietnam, we mentioned India, we mentioned Mexico, also do to try and accommodate some of that relocation, right? And so building scenarios based on those two factors, right? And we've got a report out actually from a few months back where we lay out those 4 scenarios for global supply chains, and those are the 2 axes we're looking at, and we're saying, okay, there's a world where it's very easy to get out of China, and there's a lot of policy impulse, and so things move very, very fast. And there's a world where it's very hard to get out of China, and there's no policy impulse at all, and that is probably the extreme kind of example of non-diversification and just China gobbing up and absorbing even more supply chain, right? So it is helpful because in a way, all of those, once again, are credible outcomes. But if you're a company, the implication for your business, for your operation, for your sourcing, for all of it is extremely different. So it's a worthy exercise. And then it's also a helpful exercise because it allows us to kind of realize and understand that not every single version of the word is credible and plausible, right? There are core drivers to the future and the future of supply chains. And the main one here from the policy side is US policy impulses and structural forces in US policy impulses, right? Trying to rebalance the trade relationship with China, trying to stay as a technological leader, trying to have more resilient supply chains and less dependency on the rest of the world, etc. And those core drivers won't go away, right? So there's no future in the next 4, 5, 6 years where the US isn't kind of concerned with China in those kinds of ways. But there are also very, very strong constraints and what we would call arresters to to some of those policy impulses, right? And inflation in the US, job creation in the US, the political situation in the US and in other countries, the ability of Trump to bring investment onshore into the US versus a situation where too much uncertainty just drives investment out or no investment at all, right? Those are very, very strong constraints on what could happen. And so I think for companies, and this is my last word, but it's also a therapeutic and a nice exercise to know that, of course, the futures can be very diverse and they can be very, very different from today, but there are also bounds to where the future goes and where the trajectory goes, right? The sky's not the limit, and there are things that ground those scenarios in real-term constraints. And even when we think about Trump and Trump policymaking, which once again is the topic of the day, there are many more uncertainty. You spoke about this, Daria, right? But if we think about just that one big uncertainty in the room, even that is constrained, right? Like Trump can't do anything they want, and there are constraints to what will eventually happen. And so that's also a good exercise. So let me maybe stop here and see reaction.
Thank you very much, Agatha. Just maybe before giving the floor to the audience for questions, and Agatha hinted at some relevant questions from the floor, so I guess you will have probably many others. Let's just, Arthur, you could react and probably bring also other relevant examples from what you see, and probably also regarding how corporates you work with are adapting to these evolving US trade policies. You told me yesterday, and you mentioned very relevant and very important example of how companies are trying to circumvent some of the direct effect of US trade policy recently. I thought it was very interesting to bring that.
Yes, glad to. So I think what I need to share with you is how creative our customers can be when it comes to navigating tariffs and economical constraints. I will share maybe some interesting example because I think from a research or academical point of view, it's very hard to get a grasp of what customers will do. I know how familiar you are with Incoterms, which are basically the terms between a buyer and a seller on an international transaction. So basically sharing the responsibility between the buyer and the seller on who gets to basically when the responsibility is handed over and is it in the country of departure, country of arrival, etc. Usually international trade, especially coming from Asia, is structured around FOB terms, which is basically the buyer, be it in US or Europe, gets the good and the responsibility on the Chinese port. So basically, it's the responsibility of the buyer to put it on a cargo ship, clear the customs in the US, etc. So this is the reason for this is very operational, which is both in terms of costs and grasp over the business. It's easier for importers to manage this part. And this is how it's been done for a long time. Right now, we see very, very peculiar changes, switching from FOB Incoterms to DDP Incoterms, which basically means that the seller is in charge of everything until you deliver to the buyer's warehouse, for two reasons. The first reason is outsourcing compliance and outsourcing risk management to the supplier. Basically, in a world where the President Trump can decide a new policy every day, which is very hard to implement on the custom side of the US, the custom administration is struggling to match the pace and I would say the detail of what actually Trump is trying to say when he says that pharmaceuticals should be taxed, etc. So first of all, what they say is basically, I want my Chinese supplier to take the risk of the custom classification and let him take the risk of the uncertainty of what my good should be classified as and the amount of tax I should pay. So that's the first thing that we see, which is peculiar coming from a world where the buyers would take that responsibility. Second thing that we see, and that's very hard to grasp for me from an academical standpoint, is that when you switch from FOB to DDP, the basis for the tariff changes. If you do FOB, it's the value of the goods in the transaction between basically the US importer and the Chinese supplier. If the Chinese supplier is exporting directly to the US and filling the custom paperwork, the basis for the custom is calculated on the cost of the product declared by the Chinese supplier. So it doesn't include the actual cost of selling to the US supplier. So basically what it means is that some US importers are asking their Chinese supplier to under-declare the value of their goods, which is absolutely unauditable for the US customs to see how much it costs to produce a shoe in the province of Xinjiang, etc. So they basically can put, they have flexibility when it comes to the, value of the goods that they declare, which end up lowering the tariff, cost for the US importer. So that's the kind of, reaction and creativity and versatility that we see on the ground that are new to us, because usually this was not the kind of things happening. So I think this is maybe a relevant element to share. And I'd like to comment on Daria's point as well, of how our customers are dealing with, the additional constraint, the new norms that are being added, etc. And I really think that, and also switching from a cost-only perspective to also conformity and risk-oriented mindset. A French economist that's called David Bavrez has a very interesting take on this that you may know, which is that he advocates for the creation of chief geopolitical officers in the executive committees of European companies to be able to better assess and understand the actual risks that they have on their supply chains and integrate I would say more of a geopolitical insights on the decisions that are made today, because, and I absolutely second that, I believe that the risk is absolutely underestimated or underassessed with our corporate customers today, that don't fully grasp the risk of policy changes, byproducts that we discussed. So I believe that there's a very fragile grasp of these topics currently at customers, and I do believe that putting this risk management topic at the forefront would be absolutely beneficial for the future.
Thank you very much, Arthur. Maybe it's time for question from the floor. I don't know if someone is circulating the mic, but do we have questions for panelists?
So more than a question, actually, is a comment on what has been said before. That I agree that we don't often take into account the creativity and the alternative ways that the business find to circumvent current problems. And but in the end, actually, the entire history is almost of trade is almost is characterized by this, beginning with the famous case of the pergament paper being invented because of an export embargo of papyrus from Egypt to the Greek cities of Anatolia, to the case we have seen this morning of Ricard being sold using camels because of shortage of gas. So certainly this should not be underestimated. And actually the problem is that we don't really estimate it to begin with, because it's rather for what I know, is rather a complicated task, but certainly would be a very interesting research objective that if I were a trade economist, then maybe I would pursue.
Well, thank you very much, Federico. I don't know who would like to react to that, but obviously, I think it raises a question of the effect of all the export control and the export bans that we are currently observing, and I know that there is literature on the impact of previous export bans for rare earths from China, and it has spurred innovation that allowed to circumvent some of the adverse effect that was anticipated from that. So it raises a very interesting question. Agatha, I understood that you wanted to react to that, or?
No, very, very quickly, just to say, I think this is a very fair point, and I think this is the big difference between kind of new trade measures, and companies are going to adapt to that. And then uncertainty, right? When we speak to our clients and when we speak to companies, they say we can take anything, right? Like as long as the trade measure is clear, it is predictable, it stays in time for a number of years, we will adapt and we will make it so that we can continue to do what we want to do, right? Or what we would like to do within legal bounds, don't get me wrong. But the problem is the uncertainty, right? If it changes every couple of years, or if it changes every 6 months, or if once a trade deal like the USMCA has been negotiated by an administration, it can be turned off and renegotiated in between cycles, and relitigation is just the name of the day, then this is where it's complicated. So just a comment to say I agree. But there's a difference now with the current cycle, I think, with the level of uncertainty where businesses are saying we could take tariffs, we could take very drastic measures from the US administration. What we can't take, or what is the hardest at the moment, is just the uncertainty, like within the next week, within the next month, within the next year. We just don't know what the words is going to look like.
From Kevin O'Rourke in the back. Is there a mic available somewhere?
Well, it was a sort of reaction to your question, then I had a sort of reaction to Julian. So the reaction to your question is that, I mean, indeed, being able to innovate is a dimension of resilience that people don't talk about enough. And I mean, but then, you know, it's important to have the capacity to innovate. So I'm thinking about France, for example, during the Napoleonic Wars, they wanted to substitute for imported metallurgical products. And it turned out they didn't actually have the capacity to do what the Brits were doing in terms of cast iron and things. They tried, and it was just too complicated. On the other hand, the French had very good chemists. And so when they needed to import, to innovate and develop artificial saltpeter, which is important for explosives and so on, they were very good at that, you know. So your prior manufacturing and innovative capacity is very important for your resilience. So maybe we should think more about that. And then I just had a response to Julian. May not be the way you want to go with it, Julian, but what you're essentially saying is that, you know, trade has limited aggregate welfare effects in large closed economies. So, you know, the Americans, you know, are not nice to us, and it'll hurt us, but not that much. And I guess by implication, if we were to retaliate, that it would cost us as well, but not that much. You know, these things matter more for smaller, more open economies. And so it strikes me that if you want to maintain the world rule-based trading system, it probably is important that countries not be allowed to just tear up the rule book and have no negative consequences whatsoever. So you could argue that it's the large closed economies like China and Europe who have a moral responsibility to make the Americans rethink. And I completely agree with you. It's really important that we don't get involved in a bilateral Barney with the Chinese, because then we are looking more like a fragmenting world economy a la 30s.
Thank you very much for that. Julian, do you want to respond to Kevin's? Okay, please. The floor is yours.
No, absolutely. No, I fully agree. I think that, so I talked about that, the economic rationale for retaliation, but I do agree that there's a political economy rationale for this. And that's why I think it's very important that how the EU is now gonna, I mean, the deal, if it's going to be a two-sided deal, or if Trump just sends a letter, but if it is a two-sided deal, that is WTO compliant. I think that is of utmost importance. And this, in the same vein, I think it's the EU should have been, or should be, a lot more vocal when it comes to this UK-US deal, which is very clearly not compatible with WTO rules. And I think there's been a remarkable silence about this. And so in some ways, I'm not sure, I think this may have been Richard Baldwin suggesting that, you know, maybe the US should just get out of the WTO. That would make things a bit easier. But it's, no, I certainly agree that it is up to the bigger economies now to stand up for the rule of trade law.
Yeah. Thank you. Thierry, please.
So I'd like to react first to what was just said by Kevin. It is indeed the small countries that can have a big effect, much larger than, and especially that's why Ireland is in the EU, no? That's the whole idea, and that's why the deal, the so-called deal negotiated by UK on its own, is like almost a joke, because they don't have the firepower to actually withhold anything. So I completely agree that the big player need to actually be the ones that actually play that game. And speaking of game theory, that brings me to my second remark. I think it was very well said by Agatha. What really is more damaging in the uncertainty. So there's a lot of research now saying that trade uncertainty is actually maybe even more damaging than trade barriers. That has actually a very large effect. It made me think that maybe, we all try to think about what is the strategy behind. Maybe it is the Trump administration strategy, is to be completely unpredictable, completely random, like in his speech, right? So that it really makes a long-run disruption because nobody knows what's going on, and so nobody can adapt. And fundamentally, Trump is against trade, so that destroys trade, and that's very, very good for him in terms of in his mind. So maybe the old game theory of brinkmanship and you don't know what I'm going to do, so maybe I can do it, and maybe not. That part of the whole theory, strategy.
Anyone want to comment on what Thierry just said, or?
No, just to say that in Trump 1.0 at least, China uncertainty was definitely a strategy. When you spoke to Trump officials, Trump administration officials, they made it very clear that the uncertainty they were injecting into the relationship was on purpose, because if you raise trade barriers or if you raise certain export controls, then once again, companies will adapt to that. And if there's a case to being in China, they will still be in China. And so the only way that they thought kind of strategically to try and hurt those ties, trade and investment ties, even further was to inject a whole lot of uncertainty in the relationship. I don't know about the second Trump administration, but who knows?
Maybe just to complement on that, I heard from Lighthizer that being unpredictable is indeed part of the strategy, and because the best response you have to this uncertainty is just to invest in the US, which is the only safe place in the investment landscape. So it seems to be, at least for his understanding and the way things work, a strategy. And just maybe because Thierry mentioned the UK-US trade deal, and Agatha, you hinted at possible comments on the recently announced Vietnamese-US trade deal, and I read your very interesting note published yesterday on the analysis of this trade deal. Maybe you can comment a little bit on that, and notably on the interesting aspect regarding the 40% for transshipped goods and how you interpret that.
Yeah, and I think, maybe a few things to say here, right? One of the biggest uncertainty with this new Trump administration is whether they're anti-China, which was really the core of Trump 1.0, or whether they're anti-trade, right? And one of the key differences from Trump 1.0 is the very, very strong America First policy and agenda we're seeing. As a matter of fact, the trade policy strategy was called America First Trade Policy Memo, right? So that just tells you a lot about what's happening. But what we're seeing and what's very interesting is there still is, and I was speaking about those core structural forces in the US-China relationship that remain, whichever administration, had it been a Harris administration, Trump administration, and that has a very, very strong China focus. And in a way, you might like it or not, but it is comforting to see in the UK deal and the Vietnam deal the fact that China is very much at the center of policymaking and the center of the design of those deals, right? Because then maybe as a company, you can have a little bit more certainty about what the world will look like in the future. Once again, think about scenarios. It's much harder to envision a world where just the US just doesn't like trade, because the US needs trade. And so it's a little bit harder to fathom. All that to say, the two deals we've seen so far, and the details are scanned, there's a little bit more on the UK deal, there's a little bit less on the Vietnam deal, no more than just just a tweet really. But the UK deal, if you read through the lines and between the lines, it's all about China, right? That all of the Section 232 carve-outs are pretty much all about secure supply chain. And in US parlance those days, secure supply chains mean China-less or China-free supply chain, right? And so there's a very, very big focus on China. There's focus on Chinese ownership in the steel sector in some of that agreement, in part of that agreement. And so the UK deal, you know, whatever you think of it, is a very China-focused deal. And when you look at the Vietnam deal, it's a very China-focused deal as well. What the Trump administration is saying is pretty much Vietnam exports are going to get a 20% tariff rate when they get into the US. But if they have transshipping in them, they will be tariffed at 40% now, of course. Or what I believe or think that Trump's not speaking about transshipment and pure transshipment, which is first and foremost illegal for the most part. But he's actually speaking about goods made in Vietnam with a lot of Chinese value add, right? Like if you followed the policy debate and if you followed some of the discussion between the US and Mexico already on Chinese value add content within Mexico's exports to the US, then when you read the Vietnam deal or the tweet of the Vietnam deal, then this is what comes out. It is a really complex one. It's interesting that Vietnam was so fast to say yes to it, because it is a very, very big ask of the US to say, you've been, I mean, pretty much all or a huge part of your manufacturing boom, Vietnam, of the past 6, 7, 8 years since the first trade war has been on the back of Chinese companies and Chinese inputs. And so you are willing, because the US is such a big export market for the Vietnamese economy, you are willing to try and bear the cost of weaving those dependencies down in return for market access. It will be really hard, because if you look at how much of Vietnam's electronics exports to the US are relying on Chinese value add, how much of textile exports to the US are reliant on Chinese value add, etc. It will be a very, very hard feat for Vietnam to make that work, right? And so it's likely that for a few years, you're actually going to have pretty high tariffs on a number of Vietnamese goods going to the US. But over time, it could create the, once again, critical mass to get some of the suppliers onshore to Vietnam, depending on the exact details. And so it will be interesting to see. The other thing to say is if Vietnam said yes, it will be very interesting, because it's probably going to be the model with Thailand. It's probably going to be the model with Cambodia. It's probably going to be the model with everyone in ASEAN. And so do they say yes, right? Do those countries say yes? Much harder for Cambodia with very, very strong ties to China. Thailand, potentially. Philippines would probably say yes. Indonesia is a big question mark. So we'll have to see, but that could be a regional almost template for the region. And so that would shock the system, because the system was so based on Chinese inputs over the past 7, 8 years.
Thank you very much, Agatha. It is obviously very interesting. And you said that China is everywhere in the Chinese, in the Vietnamese US deal. And I think that you can also interpret the fact that we know little about this deal so far, just because also Vietnamese authorities are not very at ease with communicating with it because of the relationship they have with China also. So it reinforces the view that China is everywhere, even in the communication around the trade deal. I don't know if we have a last question from the floor, or yeah, Sandra.
I have a very small comment, in fact, a question. Do we know anything about tax exemptions? Because I was surprised to listen to a presentation on Trump 1.0, where I realized that many firms could claim tax exemptions when they could prove that they would run out of business, or that it would be too expensive for them. So do we have tax exemption on the Trump 2.0? Is it as massive as it was in the first case? Because in a way, it's all beneficiary. I mean, you as Agatha was saying, you force an adjustment on Vietnam, but in the end, in fact, there are no tax paid by the importers. So in a way, as Trump was saying, the adjustment is really on the sourcing countries, not on the American firms, neither on the American consumers. So do we have data? I heard that in the first Trump mandate, in fact, you had a website. Everything was pretty transparent on which firms were asking for exemptions and who was getting what for what product. So is it the same business today?
Daria. And I know that Agatha, you also worked on that, or you have probably hints on that.
Then probably Agatha can respond, but yes, and they're bigger. But if you want to look at that, you better get the data very quickly, because the transparency on those data is indeed with Doge. That's actually one area where, but yeah.
No,
If
I
you
mean,
know
the- No, I don't know the answer, and I especially don't know the answer on tax exemptions, right? Now, well, maybe Sandra, what you were meaning is tariff exemptions, right? Like, it's not, it was not tax rebate per se, but it was tariff exemption.
Yes, my
So
understanding is that Sandra was mentioning exemption to Section 301
To the tariffs,
under the first Trump administration.
Because if that's the case, what was very interesting in the first Trump administration is that you had a real ability and a capacity of U.S. businesses to lobby for exemptions, right? I can't remember exactly how much of the trade picture was exempted, but in electronics you had huge carve out. In textile you had a little bit of carve outs. I mean, in all kinds of sections, if you had a company in the U.S. that did their job, went to the Hill and made their case, usually or to some extent they got an exemption, right? So that was a very big item. It was also very interesting. We've heard from counterparts at MOFCOM in China that the Chinese also granted, exceedingly enormous, very, very, very wide exemption. I think up to 90% of all of the tariffs put in place were actually not implemented in Trump 1.0, right? So there was a tit for tat, 1-for-1 kind of on paper tariff escalation, but the US side exempted a whole lot. The Chinese side exempted almost 90% of it, right? Which tells you also there are constraints to what you can do. There are constraints to how much you can shut global trade, and you still have citizens that you can respond to. This time around, though, we know and we expect that large US businesses are not going to get Trump's ear as easily as last time around. The point, once again, is an America first reshoring agenda, much less than a China-focused agenda. And if that's the case, then we've, of course, already seen the exemptions on electronics, but they depend on whatever happens to the semiconductor 232, Section 232 tariffs. But we would expect that exemptions are fewer. In the case of China, you're already seeing China in their own tit for tat granting exemptions for most important, most critical goods for their economy, right? So there will be a little bit of that as well. But on the US side, I think there will be less this time around, or considered in the context of trade deals. We're going to see what comes out of the EU-US negotiation, but probably much more limited.
Thank you very much. I think we took the last question, so it will be time for me to just thanks for panelists of today's second round table. Thank you very much for joining.
Thank you. Well, thanks, Simon.
Thank you, Julian, and thank you, Agatha, for joining online, and see you soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daria, and thank you, Arthur. So we are closing today's conference. Thank you very much for attending it. I understand that there will be some drinks served outside, so do not hesitate to stay 5 minutes to enjoy the drink. And for those who are interested and who have registered, you can also participate in the visit of the TANGRAM Center. I think it is planned around 4:45. So we have 30 minutes before starting. Thank you very much again, and we will organize this conference again next year, and we will be very, very happy to welcome you again. Thank you very much.